Hispanic and Latino communities represent the second largest ethnic group in the United States, and they account for more than a quarter of our nation's students. But does our education system reflect the rich diversity that exists within our schools? Are English language learners getting the support they need to thrive inside the classroom and out? And are Hispanic and Latino cultures being adequately represented in the push for greater equality in our curricula? Are we doing enough to prepare for an influx of Hispanic and Latino students? And how can we ensure that these students feel welcome when they walk through our school doors? This is what I want to know. That the Hispanic and Latino population is growing by leaps and bounds in this country. According to the 2020 census, half of the population growth in this country, in the United States, was in the Hispanic and Latino population. And now 1/4 of all American school-age students are Hispanic and Latino students. What does the census tell us about this new reality, and how can we avoid what you experience in terms of the acceptability?
I think the story is not just in the magnitude of the numbers that you've described and how they play out in public schools, because the Latino population nationwide is younger than other populations. So there are more school-age kids in the Latino population and even more preschool-age kids in the Latino population in comparison to others. So what you're describing is going to become even more pronounced in our public schools in future years. But I think the other story is how broadly distributed across the country the Latino population is now. And that's been true and going on for the last quarter century or more. Certainly when MALDEF, the organization that I have the honor of leading, was founded in 1968, you could fairly describe the Latino population in the United States as regional.
Yeah.
Concentrated in the Southwest, from Texas to California, with pockets in Chicago, New York City, and South Florida, but a regional minority population. But what the census confirms is that Latinos are now present in significant numbers in every region and virtually every state in the country. And that is the challenge, because states like California, states like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, that have long had significant student populations from the Latino community are better prepared to address some of those issues. Far from perfect. There's still lots of work to be done, as you know, even in those systems. But I have concerns about some of the systems where this is a newer phenomenon, having significant numbers of Latino kids. States in the Southeast, states in portions of the Midwest, states in the Northeast, where there is not that experience. You have to be concerned about whether those schools are prepared to take the steps necessary to ensure that they're serving that growing population. There is, as you know, this long tradition in this country of local control, down at the school board, local district level. And some of these districts are quite small, as you know. So it really, this long-standing loyalty to local control has some positive elements. But too often it means that we are not able to ensure a more uniform experience, and in particular, a more uniform attentiveness to addressing civil rights issues in education.
I couldn't help but think about what you, me, many others went through with the Common Core discussion. Whenever you talk about, using the national, not just bully pulpit, but federal legislation to ensure that people's rights are protected, that schools are accountable. We had 48 or 49 states agree to Common Core before the fear-based politics kicked in. How do we reconcile that?
I think it was a troubling occurrence in the end because of exactly what you described. The fear, this over loyalty to local control and maximizing local control became a real problem. And it's not reality, because the truth is today, Many, many kids are going to start their education in one state, and they're going to end up moving to another state. Now, 50, 60, 70 years ago, that was far less true. But today, it means we need a more uniform national educational system. And that means that things like Common Core are critical. We've got to get back to the ability to ensure greater uniformity and not be afraid of it, because it is to the benefit of kids, not just the kids who move, but kids across the board. Goes back to something recognized, as you know, in Brown versus Board of Education, which is that our public schools are really what bring us together as a country, as a people. It is that experience shared across boundaries of race, across boundaries of income, across boundaries of geography. It is that shared experience that unites us as a people when there's so many other things working to tear us apart.
It seems like there are more and more, even in the wake of the pandemic, more and more of these kind of sort of single bullet efforts to throw a dart in the face of equality and equitable treatment. How do we deal with that?
The fact is that what the pandemic forced upon our public education system, namely remote learning, has had racially disparate effects on our student body. And we now have to engage with real creativity, but most importantly, with real clear direction to address those inequities. We really have to be talking nationwide about what compensatory education is essential, because it is essential to make up for what occurred over the last year and a half because of the pandemic. We've got to acknowledge the racial disparities, and we've got to invest our efforts in a way that addresses those disparities. If you don't call out the problem and define it accurately, you're never going to solve it. And this reluctance to accurately and openly talk about racial inequity is an ongoing problem.
The DREAM Act, DACA, how do you see that playing out?
I think it's absolutely clear that huge supermajorities of people across the country support providing some permanent status and pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients and other students similarly situated. It's an extension of access to the K-12 schools that you suggested, and it's true. A history of MALDEF is about ensuring access for undocumented students to our public K-12 schools. The extension is we then need those kids to have the opportunity to go on and get a higher education and contribute to our economy and our society and our leadership in the ways that they can. So I think it will be solved. The problem right now is this issue, which should be bipartisan. If you look at the levels of support in the general populace across the country, it should be bipartisan. So far is not.
I'll do the wave the magic wand. Let's wave a magic wand. Tom Saenz is in charge. He's designing the governance structure for Los Angeles County schools. What kind of things would you put in place, particularly that are different?
Well, I think there's two issues. One is at the very core of who is our governing body. And as you know, when I worked for Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, I worked with him in ways that many viewed as undermining the governance of LAUSD, because it certainly was a challenge to the existing governance system, which was electing school board members to that body. There are two problems with that. The first is a tremendous mismatch that's increasing, given the numbers we've talked about, between the parents of students in schools and who's voting. Because so many parents are not yet eligible to vote in our elections because they're not citizens yet. And until they're citizens, they will have no voice in the election of those who are then making consequential decisions for their kids. And the second problem is when you have an election to a body whose charge is limited, in this case, to an issue that's extremely important. No one would deny the importance of education. But when it's so limited, you run the danger that those who have direct interest of whatever kind into that system become the major players.
We talked about government structure. When it comes to the acceptability of the growing number of Hispanic and Latino students, I want to talk to you about moving hearts and minds. So this is what I really want to know. How do we gain cultural acceptance of Hispanic and Latino students in America's schools?
Well, I think it starts with increasing knowledge of that community and its history. The history of Latinos in this country, even though, as I said, 50 some years ago, we were a regional population, it's deep and long, and it is full of commitment to the United States. So that's really shared across whether you're a citizen or not, how long your family has been here, how many generations, or how many days you've been here. And we need to take that shared commitment and make sure everyone understands it. There's too many who have demographic fear. So we have to take away that threat with that factual basis, the historical basis of commitment. And I think we also have to ensure that leadership is not seeking to exploit that demographic fear in irresponsible ways. That's what we saw with Donald Trump, but it wasn't new. You mentioned Proposition 187 in California. We saw it with Pete Wilson. He exploited demographic fear of the growing Latino community to secure his own reelection as governor. Jan Brewer in Arizona used SB 1070, another infamous anti-immigrant measure. She used demographic fear of the growth of the Latino population in Arizona to secure her election as governor. She had succeeded to the position when Janet Napolitano left. Donald Trump did the same at a nationwide level. That's why he launched his campaign, as you recall, in the middle of 2015 with a slur against all Mexican immigrants, that they were criminals and murderers and rapists. That was all, and that was an ongoing theme. That was all about seeking to exploit that demographic fear. We've got to end that. We've got to put more of our outreach and education on understanding our common shared philosophies, our common shared commitments to the future.
I am leading education policy at all levels, from early childhood to K-12 and higher education for the largest Latino civil rights organization in the U.S. That is a professional dream come true, but it's also something that is very personal to me. And my day-to-day really varies, which is what keeps things challenging and exciting, is that every day there's a new battle or fight, right, to achieve education equity for students that have been historically marginalized in the system. And so I do a lot of work at the federal level in terms of working with Congress members and staff on the Hill to influence policy, budgetary decisions, as well as with the administration at the Department of Education in issuing guidance and putting forth administrative policies that are going to help the most students in need. And all of that is especially critical at this time when we have been in the pandemic really for a lot longer than people thought. A year and a half, we're about to enter the third school year under the pandemic. And in fact, many schools have already started. And that's really elevated the inequities that already existed in the education system and the achievement gaps that have widened as a result of the last year and a half.
What are the needs that must be addressed in our schools to make sure that the diverse needs of learners that you represent are being met?
There's definitely a need for equitable funding and resources to make sure that the schools and the students with the highest need and that have the highest rates of poverty actually receive the most funding.
So Amalia, let me unpack that, because I know what you're talking about, but a lot of times people will say, well, it's not about money. But what do you mean by equitable funding? Because aren't schools funded the same anyway or not?
That's not actually how it plays out. And we have a lot of data that shows that even though funding is supposed to go towards Title I schools, which are the schools with the highest population of students with poverty, when you see that the resources that come from the federal government and that trickle down to the state and local levels, it's the schools with the most privileged populations, with the most resources that actually garner the most. And we have long fought for transparency in terms of how that funding is allocated to make sure that it's actually targeted to support the students with the most needs. And that includes English learners, most of whom are Latino English learners like myself, most of whom are Latino, and for whom there has been an underinvestment in targeted support at the federal level, the state and local level as well.
I lived this for so many years in my public life. It's hard for people to understand not just the federal funding, but most of the funding for schools come from the state.
That's right.
About 90% in most instances. And most states have interesting funding formulas for education, often tied to taxes. So communities that have a large tax base or significant income base, they often get the higher funded schools. It's supposed to be equalized by way of Title I. But still, when it flows down, studies have shown that for minority populations, kids who happen to be Black, Hispanic, born in poverty, those schools still get less. How can we change that? And this is an issue that's existed for many years.
I think part of that is who is making these decisions, right, in terms of allocating and targeting those funds. And that's the district administrations, school boards at the local level. And I think what we need to see more of is diverse decision makers, right? People who come from the communities that are impacted, that are able to be in a position of authority to be able to have a say in those decisions. And oftentimes that is not the case.
And you've championed that. In fact, I think you've given an example. States like Arizona, where half the student population happens to be Hispanic or Latino, and only 10% of the policymakers come from that demographic. How can we change that, and what should we be pressing for to ensure better representation, to ensure that there's equitable distribution of resources?
Well, there's a lot of things, both from the ground up, right, and from the grassroots, and also from the grass tops. At the grassroots level, we have a network of 300 affiliates. These are community-based organizations that are formal partners of Unidos, and we do a lot of work with them to develop and cultivate leadership skills, but also in terms of being able to encourage them, right, to use their community networks, their real life expertise to be able to throw their name in the hat and go after these positions, and also to educate and inform our community about the importance of having representation, not only in running for office, for Congress, or even at the state level, but at the local level where a lot of these critical decisions make a real impact and difference.
Are today's teachers properly trained to be able to assist with the academic needs and the immersion of Hispanic Latino learners in schools?
So that's definitely an area where we could do better. Even during the pandemic, when schools pivoted pretty much overnight to remote learning, the U.S. Department of Education had already issued a report that found that English learner teachers had actually received less professional development in remote instruction. And obviously that's something that had an impact as schools switched to remote. So not only professional development, but also in terms of just preparation in teaching programs and credentials for English learner teachers, but also for all general teachers, because most teachers will see an English learner students in their lifetime at some point in the classroom. And so it's really important that teacher preparation programs also institute those kinds of practices that are linguistically and culturally relevant into their practice.
What about these dual immersion programs? Are there, what do you think needs to be done to give them more of a robust sort of opportunity to help kids?
Yeah, with dual immersion programs, it's really interesting because there's actually a lot of support for dual language programs. But at the same time, if you look at the data of who are the students that are actually enrolled in these dual language programs, a lot of times it's not the students who actually need them or could benefit the most, including English learners. So this is the case, for example, in Arizona, where we have been trying to repeal a proposition that voters passed 2 decades ago that really restricted bilingual education. Now, dual immersion programs do exist in some form, but many of those slots are very limited, and only a few of English learners have actually been able to access them. And so there is this issue with dual immersion programs, just the model and concept themselves, but it has become an access issue as to we have no problem with English-speaking students, right, who are trying to learn Mandarin or French. But if it comes to students who are native Spanish speakers or who may speak another language at home, they do not have the same level of access to these dual immersion programs.
Oh, Amalia, there's so many roads I could go down on that one, and I won't because it just it is not surprising, but I didn't know it was that significant an issue. Let me ask you one other question about the academics, because this idea of assessments and standardized tests and how you measure a student's progress for immigrant students, students that come from other countries like you did, if they don't have the support, it may take them a little time to get acclimated. And this sort of above the line, below the line measurement based on, one test or a certain period of time, it's not always fair to the students. And sometimes it doesn't always recognize the growth. So what is your view about how we should look at standardized tests as it relates to this population of students?
Sure. Yeah. And, standardized tests are one way, right, to measure progress and student success. We have actually been advocating for native language assessments, which are encouraged under federal law in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the overarching K-12 federal law. But there is no federal funding necessarily to help states either adopt these programs or scale them up. We have been working in the state of Florida, for example, where you have not only a significant population of Latino Spanish-speaking students and immigrant families coming from places like Venezuela, for example, but you also have a significant Haitian Creole population. And so we have actually been working in partnership to try to pass a bill there where the state would adopt a native language assessments program, whereas students that are native Spanish speakers or native Creole speakers can actually take those assessments in their native language, which would give us a more meaningful read, an accurate read in terms of what level they are actually at academically in math and science in particular. And so just making sure that we have an NLA program would help to both put a better spotlight on where these students are at to make sure that they are properly placed and that we are making sure that they receive the supports and proper instruction to continue their education.
It seems to me that policymakers should be adjusting some of their historical views on this issue to meet the growing population of the students that need help. So, Amalia, this is what I really want to know. If you had to share one important message to policymakers about the needs of Hispanic and Latino students, what would that be?
Well, what I would say first and foremost is that Latino students are worth making an investment on because we are the future workforce of the U.S. and we are growing in numbers. And it's important to make sure that we have an education trajectory.
Well, Amalia Chamorro, I appreciate your work. Thanks for listening to What I Want to Know. Be sure to follow and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you can explore other episodes and dive into our discussions on the future of education. And write a review of the show. I also encourage you to join the conversation and let me know what you want to know using hashtag WIWTK on social media. That's hashtag WIWTK. For more information on Stride and online education, visit stridelearning.com. I'm your host, Kevin P. Chavous. Thank you for joining What I Want to Know.